Picture this, a sun-scorched desert landscape, a lonely cave tucked away in the cliffs, and inside, clay jars that have stood silent for 2,000 years. Within those jars, fragile scrolls of parchment and papyrus, their edges crumbling but their words still vivid words that would shake the foundations of religious history and challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Who were the people who carefully inscribed these texts, hiding them away with such purpose, and why did they vanish, leaving behind only whispers in the dry desert air? These are the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of all time, and the beginning of a medieval mystery that continues to baffle scholars and seekers alike. When a young Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon the first of these scrolls in the late 1940s, he had no idea he was unlocking a story that would captivate the world. These weren't just old documents, they were windows into a lost community, a group of devout individuals who lived, worked, and worshipped in the harsh wilderness near the Dead Sea. Their writings include some of the earliest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, along with prayers, rules, and apocalyptic visions that offer a raw, unfiltered glimpse into a turbulent time in history. But despite decades of research, the identity of these scribes remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of antiquity. Were they monks, rebels, priests, or prophets? What drove them to isolate themselves and create such a rich library of sacred texts? Join me as we step into their world, tracing the clues left behind in fragile ink and aged parchment. This is more than just a historical investigation, it's a journey into faith, secrecy, and the enduring human desire to preserve truth in times of uncertainty. Over the course of this video, we'll explore the theories, the controversies, and the haunting questions that still surround the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. By the end, you'll not only understand why this mystery matters, but feel the thrill of standing at the edge of discovery yourself, peering into the shadows of the past and wondering what secrets still lie waiting to be found. It all began with a simple, almost mundane act: a young shepherd named Muhammad Hib, searching for a lost goat in the arid landscape near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The year was 1947, a time when the world was still rebuilding from war, completely unaware that a spiritual and historical treasure lay hidden just beneath the surface. Frustrated and perhaps a bit bored, the teenager picked up a stone and tossed it into a small opening in the limestone cliffs, expecting to scare the animal out. Instead, he heard the unexpected sound of shattering pottery. Curiosity piqued, he climbed up to investigate and found himself peering into a dark, narrow cave. Inside, he discovered several large clay jars, some still sealed with lids. Hoping for gold, he and his cousins later returned to crack them open, only to find something they found bizarre and disappointing at first: bundles of dark, aged leather and papyrus inscribed with writing they couldn't understand. These weren't just old scraps, they were the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls, carefully preserved in those jars for nearly 2 millennia. The shepherds, part of the Taamaya Bedouin tribe, had no idea of the value of what they held. They bundled up a few of the scrolls and eventually took them to a dealer in Bethlehem, thinking they might fetch a small sum. The initial reactions on the antiquities market were a mixture of confusion and skepticism. One scroll even ended up hanging on a tent pole for a time, a forgotten ornament in a nomadic camp. It was a slow, stumbling process. These fragile documents passed through several hands, from merchants to religious leaders, before their true age and significance were even suspected. The lack of immediate recognition is itself a fascinating part of the story. The world of archaeology and theology wasn't actively searching for such a find. It arrived completely by accident, a secret forced into the open by a stray rock. It took months before scholars like Professor Eliezer Sukenik of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem risked a dangerous journey to acquire some of the scrolls, immediately realizing their profound antiquity. He reportedly examined them in his office on November 29, 1947, the very day the United Nations voted for the partition of Palestine, a poignant coincidence that layers modern history onto an ancient discovery. What began as a boy's quest for a missing animal had unearthed a library that would forever change our understanding of the biblical world, setting off a decades-long search for more caves and the secrets they contained. Initially, the scrolls were met with a mix of awe and deep skepticism. When the first few leather and papyrus bundles made their way to scholars, their appearance was so startlingly well preserved that some experts were convinced they had to be forgeries or, at the very oldest, medieval manuscripts. The idea that Hebrew texts of such age and quality could survive in near-perfect condition for 2,000 years seemed, to many, an impossibility. One of the first scholars to examine them, Metropolitan Athanasius Yesu Samuel of the Syrian Orthodox Church, was intrigued but cautious. He and others initially placed their origins around the 10th or 11th century, a dating that, if correct, would have made them interesting historical curiosities but not the earth-shattering discovery we know today. This initial misdating is a crucial part of the mystery. It created a period of profound uncertainty where the scroll's true value hung in the balance. The turning point came through paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. A young American scholar named John Trevor photographed the scrolls in exquisite detail and sent those images to the world's foremost expert in ancient Hebrew scripts, Professor William F. Albright. Upon examining the script, Albright immediately recognized its form. He declared it was not medieval at all, but a style of handwriting used centuries before the birth of Jesus, definitively dating the scrolls to the late Second Temple period, roughly 200 years before the Common Era. His authoritative judgment sent shockwaves through the academic community, instantly rewriting the narrative and catapulting these texts from mere antiquities to some of the oldest biblical manuscripts ever found. Yet, even with this paleographic breakthrough, a sliver of doubt remained for some. Science would ultimately provide the final, incontrovertible proof. In the 1990s, advanced radiocarbon dating techniques were applied to the scrolls themselves. Tiny, carefully selected fragments of the parchment were analyzed, measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes to determine their absolute age. The results were stunningly precise, confirming Albright's initial assessment and then some. The tests revealed the scrolls were created between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. This scientific seal of approval didn't just silence the skeptics, it deepened the enigma. Now we knew for certain these texts were ancient, but that very certainty raised more urgent questions. Who were these people living 2 millennia ago who possessed such sophisticated literary culture and took such meticulous care to hide their library away from the world? The mystery of their identity had truly begun. The discovery of the scrolls ignited a race not just to decipher the texts but to find their source. If these manuscripts were 2,000 years old, who created them and where did they live? The answer seemed to lie in the very earth itself. Just a short walk from the first cave, nestled on a barren marl terrace overlooking the Dead Sea, sat the ruins of an ancient settlement known as Qumran. Initially dismissed by early explorers as a small Roman fort, this site would become the centerpiece of the mystery. Beginning in the early 1950s, archaeologists like Father Roland de Vaux embarked on extensive excavations, slowly peeling back layers of dust and stone to reveal a complex that was far more than a military outpost. What they uncovered was a blueprint for a unique way of life, a communal existence seemingly built around ritual purity, study, and work. The layout of Qumran was immediately telling. The central building was a large, multi-room structure with a prominent tower, suggesting a need for defense in this isolated location. But scattered throughout were features that pointed to a deeply religious community. Most striking were the numerous mikvot, or Jewish ritual baths. These stepped pools, carefully plastered to hold water, were fed by an elaborate system of aqueducts and canals channeling water from the distant cliffs during the rare, violent rainstorms. The sheer number of these baths, far more than would be necessary for a typical village of this size, indicates that ritual immersion was a frequent, integral part of daily life for the inhabitants. This obsession with purity is a powerful clue, echoing practices described in some of the scrolls themselves. Then there was the room that sent a shiver of excitement through the archaeological world, the scriptorium. In a long, narrow hall on the upper floor, excavators discovered the remains of low plaster benches and, even more compelling, 2 inkwells. One of those inkwells still contained traces of dried, ancient ink. For the first time, we had a physical space where the act of writing, the very creation of the scrolls, might have taken place. Imagine a scribe sitting on one of those benches, a sheet of carefully prepared parchment on his lap, patiently copying sacred texts by the light of a window overlooking the stark, beautiful wilderness. This wasn't just a village, it was a kind of monastery, a place of production and prayer. Further excavations revealed a pottery workshop with kilns and jars strikingly similar to those found in the caves, a large dining hall capable of feeding a community, and a vast cemetery with over 1,000 graves, all oriented in a north-south direction, a practice that set them apart from other Jewish burials of the time. Every piece of evidence, from the architecture to the artifacts, painted a picture of a highly organized celibate male community that had withdrawn from mainstream society to pursue a life of extreme piety and study. They were self-sufficient, disciplined, and utterly devoted to their texts. The connection seemed undeniable. The people who lived at Qumran were almost certainly the authors and guardians of the Dead Sea Scrolls, hiding their precious library in the nearby caves as the Roman army advanced, hoping to return one day to reclaim their sacred words. So the ruins of Qumran seem to offer a perfect, tangible answer. But to truly understand who lived there, we must turn from archaeology to the words of history. And here, the most compelling theory emerges, one that has dominated scholarly thought for decades. When historians began reading the descriptions left by ancient writers like Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder, they found what appeared to be a perfect match for the community at Qumran. These first-century chroniclers all wrote about a unique Jewish sect known as the Essenes, a group defined by their extreme piety, communal living, and their withdrawal from what they saw as a corrupt religious establishment in Jerusalem. Pliny the Elder, in his work Natural History, even pinpoints their location with uncanny precision. He writes of the Essenes, a solitary tribe of remarkable virtue, living on the west side of the Dead Sea, away from the shore's harmful fumes. He specifically notes they are situated below the town of Engedi. If you take a map and trace the coastline, the plateau of Qumran sits directly in that exact geographic description, nestled perfectly between Jericho to the north and Engedi to the south. This wasn't a vague reference, it was a specific address, and Qumran fitted perfectly. The lifestyle described by these ancient historians aligns almost eerily with what was found at the site. Josephus tells us the Essenes were celibate, male-only communities that held all property in common. They rejected worldly pleasures, dedicating themselves to ritual purity, prayer, and the study of sacred texts. They had a strict initiation process and were governed by a rigid set of rules. They shared meals in solemn silence, believed in predestination, and awaited a final, apocalyptic war between the forces of light and darkness. Now consider the evidence from Qumran: the large dining hall, the absence of any evidence for family dwellings, the elaborate water systems for ritual purification, the scriptorium for copying texts, and the vast cemetery of exclusively male burials. The parallels are striking and seemingly undeniable. Even more convincing were the direct connections found within the scrolls themselves. One of the most important texts discovered in the caves is known as the Community Rule. This document lays out the regulations for joining and living within a specific religious community. It describes a hierarchical, celibate group that refers to itself as the Yahad Hebrew for the community. Its members shared their possessions, underwent a multi-year initiation, and were governed by a council of 12 men and 3 priests. They held themselves apart as the Sons of Light, preparing for a final battle against the Sons of Darkness. The descriptions in the community rule are not just similar to the accounts of the Essenes by Josephus and Philo. In many places, they are virtually identical. For most scholars, this sealed the deal. The people of Qumran who wrote and copied the scrolls were the Essenes. It was a theory so elegant and well supported that it became the academic consensus for nearly half a century, the definitive answer to our central mystery. The evidence woven into the very ruins of Qumran and the words of the scrolls creates a tapestry that seems to tell a single, coherent story. The most persuasive thread in this tapestry is the remarkable alignment between the ancient historical accounts of the Essenes and the rules for daily life laid out in one of the most significant scrolls, known as the Community Rule. This document reads like a constitution for a desert monastery, and its statutes echo the observations of historians like Josephus and Philo with startling clarity. The Community Rule describes a group calling itself the Yahad, or the community, a term that perfectly captures the essence of a closed, devout society. Its members were required to surrender all personal wealth and property to a common fund, a practice Josephus explicitly attributes to the Essenes, noting that among them, riches are despised and their community of goods is truly admirable. This commitment to communal living is mirrored in the archaeology of Qumran. The large central dining hall with its adjacent pantry containing over 1,000 dishes suggests meals were prepared and consumed together, not in individual family homes. The sheer scale of this facility points to a collective society, not a traditional village. Furthermore, the community rule mandates a strict, multi-year probationary period for new members who are gradually introduced to the community's secrets and rituals. This closely parallels Josephus's description of a multi-tiered, year-long initiation process for aspiring Essenes, who received a hat, a white garment, and a small axe for digging latrines, all symbols of their new, purified life. Perhaps the most compelling parallel lies in the realm of ritual purity. The community rule is obsessed with holiness and separation from impurity, detailing numerous baths and cleansings. This textual obsession is made physical at Qumran by the discovery of those numerous mikvot, the ritual baths. The engineering feat of channeling precious water into these pools in one of the most arid places on Earth demonstrates that ritual immersion was not an occasional practice but a central, daily pillar of their existence. This aligns perfectly with historical accounts that the Essenes, before their common meals, would always purify themselves in cold water. Finally, the silent testimony of the cemetery provides what many consider the most powerful physical evidence for the Essene hypothesis. The vast majority of the over 1,000 graves excavated contain the remains of adult males, all oriented in a north-south alignment, which is unusual for Jewish burials of the period. This absence of women and children strongly suggests a celibate male community, which is exactly how both Josephus and Philo describe the main branch of the Essenes. While a small number of female and child graves have been found, they are often located on the periphery, suggesting they may date from a different period or represent a minor exception to the rule. Together, the communal rulebook, the purifying baths, the shared dining, and the solitary graves form a constellation of evidence that, for decades, seemed to point to one inevitable conclusion. Qumran was an Essene settlement, and they were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet despite this compelling narrative, cracks began to appear in what seemed like a perfect historical fit. A deeper, more critical look at the evidence revealed inconsistencies that have led a growing number of scholars to question the long-held Essene hypothesis. The first major challenge comes from the scrolls themselves. while the community rule and a few other texts seem to perfectly describe a secluded, celibate community like the Essenes, the entire library found in the caves is astonishingly diverse, containing not one but multiple, sometimes conflicting, theological voices. Alongside the strict rules of the Yahad, we find texts expressing wildly different ideas. There are scrolls that focus heavily on calendar disputes, advocating for a solar calendar of 364 days, while others seem to follow the lunar calendar used by the Jerusalem temple priests they supposedly opposed. Some texts are deeply mystical and apocalyptic, forecasting a cosmic war, while others are practical legal commentaries or even straightforward copies of biblical books like Genesis and Isaiah. This incredible variety suggests the library may not be the product of a single, monolithic group, but rather a collection of texts from different Jewish sects and communities across Judea, perhaps gathered for safekeeping. Could one small, isolated community really have held such a wide spectrum of beliefs simultaneously? This leads to the second major counterargument. The caves might not have been the exclusive library of the Qumran sect at all. Jerusalem in the late Second Temple period was a vibrant, tumultuous center of Jewish intellectual life, teeming with different groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and Essenes, all debating and writing. As the Roman army advanced on the city during the First Jewish Revolt, beginning in 66 of the Common Era, it's entirely plausible that multiple groups, fearing the destruction of their most precious texts, sought to hide them. The caves near the Dead Sea, remote and dry, would have been an ideal natural archive. In this scenario, the people living at Qumran might simply have been the guardians of this regional hiding place, or perhaps one of many groups who contributed their own scrolls to a collective cache, a time capsule of Jewish thought from a dying world. Furthermore, the archaeological link between the settlement and the scrolls, while strong, is not absolutely definitive. The famous inkwells found in the scriptorium prove that writing happened at Qumran, but they don't prove that all of the scrolls were written there. The handwriting styles found in the caves are remarkably varied, suggesting a multitude of scribes, perhaps from different locations. Some scholars argue that the Qumran complex might not have been a monastery at all, but a wealthy villa, a fortified farm, or even a pottery production center, a theory supported by the extensive workshop found on site. If that were the case, then the connection between the residents and the scrolls becomes much more tenuous. The lack of any scroll fragments found within the main buildings themselves is also a curious absence. If this was the central library, why were no texts ever left behind in the hurry to hide them? The most significant blow to the traditional theory is perhaps the simplest, a complete lack of any concrete, irrefutable proof. Nowhere in the entire collection of scrolls is the word Essene ever used. The community refers to itself as the Yahad, the Sons of Light, or other titles, but never by the name given to them by Greek and Roman historians. This doesn't disprove the link, but it does introduce a note of caution. We are relying on external observers to label a group that did not use that label for itself. The Essene theory remains the most persuasive explanation, but it is ultimately an interpretation, a best guess built on a foundation of compelling but circumstantial evidence. It is a hypothesis, not a proven fact, and this enduring uncertainty is what keeps the mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls so alive and fiercely debated to this day. This very lack of a perfect fit at Qumran has led scholars to propose a radically different and equally compelling theory. What if the scrolls were never the exclusive property of a single desert sect? Imagine instead the bustling, chaotic atmosphere of Jerusalem in the 1st century, a city teeming with different religious factions, each with their own scribes, their own libraries, and their own fiercely held interpretations of Scripture. As the Roman legions, under the future Emperor Titus, began their brutal siege of the city in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Jewish defenders would have known the terrifying likelihood of total destruction. In such a desperate hour, the priority for any learned group would have been to save not their lives but their most sacred texts. The dry, remote caves near the Dead Sea, a day's journey from the city, would have presented the perfect natural safe deposit box. This is the heart of the Jerusalem library theory, a hypothesis that elegantly explains the very diversity that the Essene model struggles to contain. Rather than a single community's private library, the Dead Sea Scrolls could represent a collective treasure, a last-minute effort to preserve the intellectual heart of Judea from Roman annihilation. The incredible variety of text suddenly makes perfect sense. The collection includes not only the strict sectarian rules of the Yahad, but also works that align with the beliefs of the Sadducees, the aristocratic priestly class who controlled the temple. There are texts that echo the philosophical debates of the Pharisees, the forebears of rabbinic Judaism. There are apocalyptic visions popular among various revolutionary groups and even straightforward, beautifully executed copies of biblical books that could have come from the great library of the temple itself. This stunning variety of writing styles, theological viewpoints, and even Hebrew dialects points not to one author, but to many. It suggests a collection assembled from the shelves of multiple libraries across Jerusalem, hastily gathered and smuggled out of the doomed city for safekeeping. The physical evidence from the caves themselves offers subtle support for this idea. While some scrolls were found neatly stored in cylindrical jars with lids, others were discovered crammed into cracks in the cave walls or even stuffed into pits dug into the floor. This haphazard method of storage hints at a rushed emergency operation rather than a careful, deliberate archiving process by a resident community that had all the time in the world. Furthermore, the dating of the scrolls aligns almost perfectly with the timeline of the Jewish revolt. The latest possible dates for the parchment and the handwriting styles fall squarely within the mid-1st century, just before the Roman assault. It creates a powerful narrative. As the walls began to crumble, different groups set aside their doctrinal differences for a common cause, preserving their sacred heritage from the torch. Proponents of this theory see the settlement at Qumran not as the author of the scrolls, but as their guardian. The community living there might have been entrusted with the task of hiding the texts due to their remote location and known opposition to the Roman occupation. They could have been Essenes, or they could have been another group entirely zealots, sympathizers, or simply custodians of the caves. Their job was not to write, but to protect. This reframes the entire discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a snapshot of a single, isolated community, but a panoramic portrait of the rich and tumultuous world of Second Temple Judaism in all its beautiful, complicated conflict. They are the surviving fragments of 100 different conversations about God, law, and the end of days, conversations that were violently interrupted but never truly silenced. This fascinating diversity within the scroll collection opens the door to another compelling layer of the mystery. If the library is not a monolithic product of a single sect, then perhaps we can identify the fingerprints of other known groups from this tumultuous period. Scholars have long scrutinized the texts, searching for clues that might connect them to the two most powerful Jewish sects of the time: the aristocratic, temple-based Sadducees and the popular, law-focused Pharisees. These were not just philosophical clubs, they were rival political and religious parties with profoundly different worldviews, and their debates shaped the very fabric of Second Temple Judaism. The discovery of certain scrolls with their distinct legal and theological emphases suggests they may have been central to these great intellectual battles. One of the most striking candidates for a Sadducean connection is the magnificent Temple Scroll. This is the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it is extraordinary in both its content and its authority. Unlike other texts that comment on laws, the Temple Scroll presents itself as a direct revelation from God to Moses, effectively rewriting the biblical books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. It provides immensely detailed, divine blueprints for a perfect, ideal temple and its rituals, far surpassing the specifications found in the Hebrew Bible. This focus on the temple, its purity, and the precise conduct of the priestly sacrifices is a hallmark of Sadducean ideology. The Sadducees were primarily drawn from the wealthy priestly and aristocratic families who controlled the temple in Jerusalem. Their authority and identity were intrinsically tied to that institution, and their interpretation of Jewish law was famously strict, literal, and centered on the written Torah, rejecting the oral traditions favored by others. The legal interpretations within the temple scroll align remarkably well with what we know of Sadducean views from later rabbinic sources. For instance, the scroll elaborates on laws of ritual purity concerning the temple city itself, a topic of paramount importance to the priestly class. It also details the specific wood to be used on the altar, a subject we know the Sadducees and Pharisees hotly debated. Perhaps most tellingly, the scroll's calendar is strictly solar, consisting of 364 days, which creates a fixed perpetual schedule for festivals. This directly contrasts with the lunar calendar used by the Pharisees and the temple authorities in Jerusalem, a difference that would have caused constant friction over the correct dates for holidays and sacrifices. The temple scroll reads like a Sadducean manifesto, a vision for a perfect temple run according to their strict, literal, and priestly interpretation of Scripture. Its presence in the cave suggests that either the Essenes shared these specific views, which is possible, or that this scroll originated within Sadducean circles and was later hidden for safekeeping. On the other side of the great religious divide were the Pharisees. While they lacked the Sadducees' temple power, they wielded immense influence among the common people through their development of the oral law, a living, evolving tradition of biblical interpretation designed to apply ancient commandments to new situations. The Pharisees believed in an afterlife, resurrection, and angels, concepts the Sadducees outright rejected. Within the scrolls, we find texts that seem to engage directly in these very debates, often siding against the Pharisaic position. A text known as MMT, or Mixat Maaseh HaTorah, some works of the law, is perhaps the best example. It reads like a letter or a treatise, explicitly outlining over 20 specific legal disagreements between the writer's group and another, larger group, widely thought to be the Pharisees or the Jerusalem establishment they influenced. The halakhic, or legal, debates in MMT are highly technical but reveal a deep sectarian divide. They argue over the proper handling of temple offerings, the purity of liquid streams, and the status of certain gifts to the priests. To a modern audience, these may sound like obscure arguments, but in their time, they were questions of supreme importance, defining who was pure enough to worship God correctly. The author of MMT consistently takes a more stringent, exclusive position, accusing the other side of being blind guides who lead the people astray. This tone of polemical debate matches the descriptions of the fierce conflicts between the Essenes or a similar separatist group and the Pharisees. The text doesn't just present a different opinion, it establishes a boundary defining the we who are correct against the you who are in error. Finding such a direct engagement with Pharisaic legal thought powerfully suggests that the scrolls are not an isolated monologue but a vibrant part of the larger Jewish conversation, a conversation that was often heated and profoundly consequential for its participants. Amidst the dense theological debates and strict community rules, the scrolls also introduce us to one of the most captivating and shadowy figures in the entire collection, a character known only as the Teacher of Righteousness. He is not named directly, but his presence looms large in several key texts, portrayed as a pivotal, almost prophetic leader for the community. The documents describe him as a priest chosen by God to guide the faithful remnant during a time of great spiritual corruption. He is the one who reveals the true meaning of the law and the prophets, interpreting ancient scriptures to uncover their hidden, end-times significance for his followers. This wasn't just about historical study, it was about unlocking a divine roadmap for the final days, and the teacher was presented as the sole authorized cryptographer. His arrival is framed as a moment of profound revelation, a turning point where the community's path became clear and their purpose was sealed. But this divine guidance did not come without fierce opposition. The texts pit the teacher against a formidable antagonist dubbed the Wicked Priest, a title that itself drips with contempt and condemnation. This villainous figure is depicted as a corrupt and powerful leader from the establishment in Jerusalem, someone who initially may have held a position of honor but who ultimately strayed from the true path, pursuing wealth, power, and personal glory. The most dramatic account describes a horrifying confrontation where the wicked priest, in a vile act of persecution, pursues the teacher of righteousness to his place of exile, a likely reference to the Qumran community itself, and attacks him on the sacred Day of Atonement, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. This wasn't just a political assassination, it was a profound sacrilege, a deliberate act of spiritual warfare designed to obliterate holiness itself. The conflict between these two figures is the great biblical drama of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a classic struggle between pure, persecuted piety and worldly, corrupt power. But who were they in real life? This is where the historical detective work becomes incredibly difficult and deeply divisive among scholars. The scrolls are deliberately cryptic, using titles instead of names, perhaps to protect the community from further persecution or to elevate the struggle to a symbolic, cosmic level. This has led to a century-long guessing game, with historians proposing a roster of potential candidates from the turbulent history of the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. The most popular candidates for the wicked priest are the Hasmonean rulers, a dynasty of high priests and kings who had seized both religious and political power in Jerusalem, a combination that the Qumran community would have seen as a monstrous abomination. Specific names like Jonathan Aphus or Alexander Jannaeus are often put forward. Jonathan, who became high priest in the mid-2nd century, was a military leader who accepted the high priesthood from a foreign king, an act that would have been seen as deeply illegitimate by a strict pious sect. Alexander Jannaeus was known for his brutal suppression of religious opponents, including a bloody civil war against the Pharisees. Either of these figures, with their blend of political ambition and contested religious authority, fits the profile of a villain who would violently oppose a purist teacher challenging his power. If the wicked priest was a Hasmonean ruler, then the teacher of righteousness would have been his contemporary. He might have been a disaffected high-ranking priest from Jerusalem himself, someone from the legitimate Sadducite line who was ousted when the Hasmoneans took control of the temple. This would explain his deep scriptural knowledge and his authority to interpret law. He would have led a breakaway group of followers into the wilderness to establish a pure temple of the Spirit, in direct opposition to the corrupted one in the city. His teachings would then be a direct reaction to this historical schism, a founding trauma that defined the community's identity as the true remnant of Israel. However, not all scholars are convinced this is a straightforward history. An equally compelling argument suggests these figures are not literal individuals but powerful theological symbols. In this view, the teacher of righteousness is not a single man but an archetype of the perfect, inspired interpreter, a figure like a new Moses or a promised messianic prophet. The conflict with the wicked priest then becomes a timeless allegory for the eternal battle between good and evil, light and darkness, a core theme throughout the scrolls. It represents the community's own struggle against the corrupt religious authorities of any age. This interpretation allows the texts to function as enduring spiritual lessons rather than locked historical records, their message transcending one specific moment in time. The truth likely contains elements of both history and symbolism. The intense personal vendetta described in the texts feels too specific to be entirely invented. It reads like the foundational story of a community born from persecution, a story that would be told and retold to reinforce their identity as the righteous few. A charismatic, historical founder, a teacher, was probably indeed opposed by a powerful enemy, a wicked priest. but over time, as the community reflected on his life and teachings through the lens of Scripture, this historical leader was gradually elevated into a transcendent, almost messianic figure. His struggles were seen as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, and his interpretations of text were granted absolute divine authority. He became the model for the community's future leaders and a beacon of hope that a final, ultimate teacher would one day arise to lead them to ultimate victory. This blending of memory and hope, of history and theology, makes the teacher of righteousness the enigmatic heart of the scrolls, a man lost to time whose spiritual legacy echoes through 2,000 years. Beyond the compelling historical parallels, the ultimate validation of the scrolls' antiquity came not from ancient texts but from modern science. When the initial paleographic analysis by scholars like Albright pointed to a Second Temple period origin, it was a brilliant and informed assessment, but it was still, in the end, an expert opinion. For a discovery of this magnitude, the academic world craved irrefutable, objective proof. That proof would eventually arrive through the meticulous application of radiocarbon dating, a technology that was still in its infancy when the scrolls were first found but would mature just in time to analyze them. The principle behind radiocarbon dating is a beautiful convergence of physics and history. All living things absorb a tiny, predictable amount of a radioactive isotope, carbon-14, from the atmosphere. Once an organism dies, it stops absorbing new carbon-14, and the existing amount begins to decay at a fixed, measurable rate. By calculating the ratio of remaining carbon-14 to the stable carbon-12 in a sample, scientists can determine how long ago that organism died. For the Dead Sea Scrolls, this meant testing the parchment itself, which was made from the skins of ancient goats and sheep. The first attempts in the 1950s were crude and required destroying large pieces of material, so they were only performed on a few scrolls, but the results were encouraging, broadly supporting the early paleographic estimates. The real breakthrough came in the 1990s with the advent of accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS dating. This revolutionary technique required only minuscule fragments of parchment, sometimes as small as a few square millimeters, preserving the vast majority of the priceless texts. Two independent laboratories, one in Zurich and another in Tucson, Arizona, were given samples from multiple scrolls, including the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Temple Scroll, to conduct blind tests. The results, published in the early 90s, were a stunning confirmation. They dated the parchment used for the scrolls to a period between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era, with the majority of the texts clustering in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. Science had spoken, and it declared the scrolls unequivocally ancient. Yet, while carbon dating could pinpoint the death of the animal, it could not pinpoint the moment a scribe dipped his pen into the ink. This is where paleography, the study of ancient handwriting, provided a crucial complementary layer of investigation. Paleographers meticulously chart the evolution of script styles over centuries, noting subtle changes in the formation of letters, the angle of writing, and the overall artistic flair of the script. The Hebrew script found in the Dead Sea Scrolls displayed a fascinating evolution, from a formal, stately style reminiscent of earlier Persian period, writing to a more streamlined, popular hand, and eventually to the distinctive, ornate Herodian script that was fashionable around the time of King Herod the Great. By comparing the handwriting in the scrolls to the handful of securely dated Hebrew inscriptions from the period, such as those on coins or tomb markers, scholars could construct a relative timeline. A scroll written in the archaic, formal script was almost certainly older than one written in the fashionable Herodian hand. This analysis allowed them to organize the hundreds of manuscripts into a rough chronological sequence, revealing that the library was not created all at once but accumulated over 200 to 300 years. This was a community that was constantly copying, studying, and adding to its sacred collection across generations. The combination of these two methods, the absolute dating of the parchment by science and the relative dating of the script by art, created a powerful consensus. However, this very precision also introduced new complexities into the authorship debate. For instance, carbon dating revealed that some of the biblical manuscripts, like the Great Isaiah Scroll, were copied much earlier than previously thought, perhaps around 150 years before the Common Era. This pushed the foundation of the Qumran community, or at least its literary activity, back to a much earlier period than some historical models suggested. Furthermore, analysis of the ink itself added another intriguing wrinkle. While most inks were carbon-based, made from soot and gum, scientists discovered that some of the scrolls were written with iron gall ink, a type that was not thought to be in common use until many centuries later. This finding initially caused a stir, suggesting to a few that some scrolls might be medieval forgeries after all. However, subsequent research proposed that the iron might have simply come from impurities in the water used to mix the ink or from the pots used to store it. This highlights the delicate dance of interpretation. Even hard scientific data requires context and can sometimes generate new mysteries even as it solves old ones. Ultimately, the scientific and paleographic evidence doesn't point to a single, simple answer about authorship. Instead, it paints a picture of a long, sustained literary tradition. The scrolls were not the product of a single decade or even a single generation. They are the work of a community, or perhaps multiple communities, engaged in a centuries-long project of preserving and interpreting their sacred traditions. The varied handwriting styles confirm a multitude of scribes, each with their own skill and flair. The carbon dates confirm the immense antiquity of the materials. Together, they tell us that whoever wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were part of a deeply rooted, sophisticated, and enduring intellectual endeavor that valued the written word above almost all else, ensuring its survival against all odds. Yet amidst the profound theological and historical debates preserved on parchment, one discovery stands entirely apart, not just in content but in its very fabric. While the other scrolls are made of leather or papyrus, one was crafted from a far more durable and enigmatic material, copper. This is the copper scroll, and it is arguably the strangest and most baffling artifact recovered from the Qumran caves. Unlike its companions filled with prayers, laws, and prophecies, this document reads like a cryptic treasure map, a detailed inventory of immense wealth hidden at various locations across the Judean wilderness. Its very existence immediately raises a startling question. Were the people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls not just spiritual seekers, but also the guardians of a vast physical fortune? The differences begin with the object itself. The copper scroll, designated as 3Q15, is not a rolled manuscript but a series of beaten copper sheets riveted together. The metal was so oxidized and brittle that scholars faced a monumental challenge simply to open it without causing it to disintegrate. They eventually had to carefully saw it into strips, a painstaking process that revealed its contents section by section. The text itself is not the elegant, practiced Hebrew of the great biblical scrolls, but a cruder, more vernacular form, closer to the spoken language of the Mishnaic period. These physical characteristics alone set it apart, suggesting a completely different purpose. This was not a text meant for regular study or liturgical reading. It was a functional record designed to last. The choice of expensive, durable copper implies that the information it held was considered incredibly valuable and meant to be preserved for a very long time, perhaps to be recovered long after parchment would have turned to dust. Then there is the content, which is utterly unique. The scroll consists of 64 numbered paragraphs, each describing a hiding place and the treasure concealed there. The descriptions are tantalizingly specific yet frustratingly vague. They mention landmarks like ruins, pools, tombs, and specific valleys, often providing measurements in cubits. The treasures listed are of almost mythical proportions: vast quantities of gold and silver ingots, precious ritual vessels from the temple, incense and priestly vestments. The final entry alone mentions a duplicate copy of this list with additional explanations, which has never been found. If taken at face value, the total sum of the treasure is staggering, amounting to tons of precious metals, worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms. This is not the inventory of a poor, ascetic desert community. It reads like the ledger of a king or the state treasury of a nation. This literal interpretation leads to a compelling historical possibility: the rescue of the temple treasury. The most popular theory among those who believe the list is real is that it describes the sacred wealth of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, hidden away by priests or zealots in the final, desperate days of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. As the legions of Titus tightened their siege around the city in the year 70, knowing the temple was a primary target, it would have been an urgent priority to save its unimaginable riches from pagan plunder. The copper scroll could be a secret record of that heroic effort, a list of caches spread across the countryside to ensure that even if one was discovered, the entire fortune would not be lost. In this light, the Qumran community, already established in the remote desert, might have been entrusted with safeguarding this list, or perhaps even participated in the hiding process itself. For centuries, treasure hunters and archaeologists alike have been drawn to this idea, attempting to decipher the clues and follow the measurements, though no significant part of the hoard has ever been conclusively found. However, the sheer scale of the treasure presents a major problem for the literal view. The amounts of gold and silver listed are so astronomically high that they surpass the recorded wealth of entire ancient kingdoms. It seems implausible that such a hoard could have been accumulated, transported, and hidden without leaving any other trace in the historical record. This has led many scholars to propose a more symbolic or spiritual interpretation. They argue that the treasures are not physical but represent esoteric knowledge, sacred scriptures, or the number of devout members in the community. The gold and silver could be metaphors for wisdom and purity, and the hiding places could be allegorical references to safeguarding these spiritual treasures until the end of days when they would be revealed. This view aligns the copper scroll more closely with the apocalyptic and mystical nature of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, framing it not as a map to riches, but as a coded text of divine secrets for the initiated. Ultimately, the copper scroll remains an enigma wrapped in a mystery, a stark metal contradiction among the fragile parchment voices from the past. Its very duality is what makes it so fascinating. It forces us to consider the people of this period not as one-dimensional monks, but as complex individuals who may have been engaged in a very practical, dangerous mission to preserve their world's most sacred objects from annihilation. Whether its list points to literal tons of gold buried in the Judean hills or to a more profound treasure of hidden wisdom, the copper scroll stands as a powerful symbol of hope, a belief that something of immense value could be saved from the coming destruction, waiting in the earth for a future time of renewal and peace. The sheer volume of writing uncovered in the caves points to a massive, coordinated effort, but to truly understand its origins, we must look closer than the words themselves. We must examine the very hands that formed them. Modern technology has given scholars a powerful new tool for this investigation: digital paleography. By scanning the scrolls at ultra-high resolutions, researchers can analyze the individual letterforms with microscopic precision, separating the subtle quirks of one scribe from another. This isn't merely about identifying different people, it's about listening for the unique voices in a 2,000-year-old chorus. The findings are revealing a far more complex picture than the old idea of a single, isolated scriptorium. We are now able to distinguish hundreds of distinct scribble hands, each with its own characteristics, from the confident, elegant strokes of a master copyist to the uneven, learning curves of a student. These distinct writing styles are not random. They fall into clear patterns and traditions. Some scribes used a formal, conservative script, carefully preserving the letter shapes of an earlier era, a style often reserved for copying the most sacred biblical texts like the Book of Isaiah. Others employed a more cursive, flowing hand that was coming into fashion around the 1st century, a style better suited for composing commentaries or community rules. This variation is a powerful clue. A single, small community would likely have developed a strong, consistent house style, with apprentices learning directly from a master and replicating his techniques. The incredible diversity of hands instead suggests that the scribes were trained in different schools or locations, each with its own stylistic preferences and pedagogical traditions, before their work eventually found its way into the same collection of caves. Beyond the shape of the letters, the very spelling of words provides another layer of evidence. Scholars studying the orthography, the spelling conventions of the scrolls have noticed dramatic inconsistencies. The exact same word might be spelled in 3 or 4 different ways across different manuscripts, or even within a single manuscript if more than one scribe worked on it. Some texts use a fuller, more clean spelling, generously adding vowel letters to clarify pronunciation, while others use a defective spelling, omitting those vowels in a much sparser, older style. This isn't a matter of right or wrong. It reflects different regional dialects and educational backgrounds. A scribe trained in Jerusalem might spell a word one way, while a scribe from a village in the Galilee might spell it another. The fact that these different spelling traditions coexist in the library is a strong indication that the scrolls themselves originated from a wide geographic area, a collection of texts from across Judea rather than the product of one homogeneous group. Perhaps the most astonishing evidence for multiple authorship comes from manuscripts that were clearly the work of a committee. The Great Isaiah scroll itself, one of the most famous and complete manuscripts, provides a perfect example. Detailed analysis shows that at least 2 different scribes worked on this single scroll. The change is not abrupt. It's a gradual shift in the handwriting, suggesting a master scribe began the painstaking work and an apprentice, perhaps mimicking his teacher's style as closely as possible, finished the final columns. We can even see where the master might have checked the apprentice's work, adding small corrections in the margins. This collaborative process reveals a living, breathing literary culture, not a static archive. It was a culture where writing was a taught skill, passed down through generations and across different groups of people who all shared a deep reverence for the written word, but expressed it through their own distinct personal hands. This incredible variety of texts is perhaps the most compelling argument against a simple, single authorship model. When we step back and look at the entire library, we find not one unified voice but a vibrant and sometimes contentious conversation. The scrolls contain everything from beautiful, calligraphic copies of the biblical books we know today to completely unknown psalms, apocalyptic visions, and detailed rule books for community life. This isn't a monologue, it's a symphony of different theological ideas, all composed during a period of intense religious ferment in Jewish history. The presence of such a wide spectrum of beliefs forces us to ask a critical question. Could one small, isolated community in the desert have genuinely held all these conflicting views at the same time? Or does this diversity point to a more complex origin story for the collection as a whole? On one end of the spectrum, we have deeply sectarian works like the Community Rule and the War Scroll, which paint a picture of a group that saw itself as the sole righteous remnant. These texts are filled with a powerful sense of exclusivity and an urgent expectation of an imminent end of days. The War Scroll, for instance, meticulously plans a final 40-year cosmic battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, a conflict to be fought with divine intervention and military precision. This is raw, dualistic apocalypticism, a belief that the present world is corrupt beyond repair and that God is about to intervene cataclysmically to establish a new order. The community that produced this text saw itself as an army of the righteous preparing in the wilderness for this final war. Yet in the very same caves, we find texts that reflect a completely different worldview. There are works like the Temple Scroll, which is less concerned with an imminent apocalypse and more focused on the perfect, practical operation of a temple and a society governed by a strict, literal interpretation of God's law. This text reads like a constitutional blueprint for a functioning theocracy, obsessed with ritual purity, temple architecture, and the precise calendar for festivals. Its tone is legal and prescriptive, not apocalyptic and expectant. Then there are the many copies of biblical books like Genesis, Deuteronomy, and the Psalms. These are not sectarian commentaries but straightforward, revered scriptures, the shared inheritance of all Jewish people, not just one isolated group. Their presence suggests a deep reverence for the foundational texts of Judaism, a common ground that existed amid the fierce sectarian debates. Perhaps most telling are the texts that directly argue with other Jewish groups of the time. The document known as MMT, or Some Works of the Law, is essentially a list of legal disagreements between the author's group and the mainstream religious authorities in Jerusalem. It lays out over 20 points of dispute on matters of temple purity, priestly gifts, and agricultural laws. This text isn't just stating a different opinion, it's actively engaged in a polemical debate, defining its own identity in opposition to others. Finding such a specific, argumentative text alongside more universal biblical scrolls creates a fascinating portrait of a collection that contains both the common core of Jewish belief and the sharp, defining edges of sectarian conflict. This theological smorgasbord is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a single, homogeneous community like the Essenes. It is hard to imagine a small, tightly knit group of celibate men simultaneously believing in an imminent cosmic war and writing detailed plans for a future temple society, all while meticulously copying traditional scriptures without alteration. A more plausible explanation is that the Qumran caves served as a geniza, a sacred storage place or an emergency time capsule for a much wider world of Jewish thought. As the Roman threat loomed in the mid-1st century, different Jewish groups, Essenes, but also Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and others, may have made the desperate decision to safeguard their most precious texts in the same remote location. They chose preservation over sectarianism, ensuring that the rich diversity of Second Temple Judaism would not be erased by the Roman legions. The library, therefore, is not a snapshot of one community's beliefs, but a panoramic family album of an entire civilization's spiritual life, saved from oblivion at the very last moment. Imagine a society where your entire religious life, when you fast, when you feast, when you make pilgrimages to the temple, is governed by a celestial clock that is fundamentally out of sync with everyone else's. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario in ancient Judea. It was a daily, grinding reality that defined one of the most profound rifts between the Dead Sea Scrolls community and the religious establishment in Jerusalem. At the heart of this schism was a seemingly dry, technical issue that was, in fact, a matter of cosmic significance: the calendar. The authors of many key scrolls weren't just following a different schedule. They were living in a different dimension of sacred time, adhering to a perfect, unchanging 364-day solar calendar, while the mainstream temple authorities operated on a flexible lunar calendar of roughly 354 days. This was far more than a mathematical disagreement. It was a declaration of theological war, a belief that the Jerusalem priesthood had not only lost its way but had lost track of God's own eternal rhythm. The solar calendar described in texts like the Temple Scroll and the Book of Enoch is a thing of mathematical beauty and divine symmetry. It consists of exactly 52 weeks divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each. Every holiday, without exception, falls on the same day of the week every single year. Passover always begins on a Wednesday, the Festival of Weeks always on a Sunday, and the Day of Atonement always on a Friday. This created a perfectly ordered, predictable, and unchanging cycle of worship. For the community, this perfection was not a human invention but a divine ordinance, a heavenly rhythm embedded in the very fabric of creation. They believed this was the true calendar given by God to the angels and to the patriarchs like Enoch and Noah, a system that kept the sacred festivals in their proper seasons forever, untainted by human error or manipulation. Theirs was a universe of absolute order where worship was perfectly synchronized with the cosmos. In stark contrast, the calendar used by the temple priests in Jerusalem was a lunisolar one based on the cycles of the moon. This calendar required human oversight and adjustment. Each new month began with the sighting of the new moon, and an extra month was added periodically to keep the lunar year aligned with the solar seasons. This system was practical, but from the perspective of the Qumran community, it was chaotic, imprecise, and deeply flawed. It relied on fallible human observation and decree, opening the door to corruption and error. More importantly, it meant that the holy days would drift through the days of the week from year to year. To a group obsessed with ritual purity and perfect worship, the idea of celebrating the Day of Atonement, the most solemn fast of the year, on a different weekday each year was unthinkable, a profound desecration that disrupted the sacred order. This calendrical conflict had devastating practical consequences. It meant the community was observing the major festivals on entirely different days than the rest of Judea. While the temple in Jerusalem was bustling with pilgrims celebrating the first day of Passover, the men at Qumran would have been in the midst of their solemn Passover rites a day earlier or later. They were not just out of sync, they were in a state of active ritual separation. To participate in the temple festivals on the wrong days would be to participate in a defiled and illegitimate worship. This calendrical difference physically prevented them from joining the mainstream Jewish community, cementing their identity as a separate and purified remnant. It was the ultimate symbol of their break from Jerusalem, a constant, living protest against a priesthood they believed had corrupted the most fundamental rhythms of faith. This obsession with the solar calendar is one of the strongest indicators that the scroll's authors belong to a specific, well-known strand of ancient Judaism. The ancient historian Josephus, when describing the three main Jewish sects, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, noted that the Essenes were unique in their devotion to the sun, praying at dawn and following a solar calendar. This detail, which might have seemed minor to Josephus, is a thunderous confirmation for modern scholars. The unwavering commitment to a solar calendar, as detailed in the scrolls, aligns perfectly with this external description of the Essenes. It becomes a cornerstone of the identification, suggesting that the community at Qumran wasn't just any separatist group. It was the Essene sect who saw themselves as the true guardians of God's eternal time, waiting in the wilderness for the day when all of Israel would finally reset its clocks to the divine rhythm. This theory of a pan-Judean time capsule brings us to one of the most dramatic and widely accepted explanations for why the scrolls were hidden in the first place: the looming shadow of the Roman war machine. Picture the scene in the year 66 of the Common Era. After decades of simmering resentment over heavy taxation and cultural oppression, full-scale rebellion erupts across Judea. Jewish zealots score initial victories, but the response from Rome is swift and terrifyingly efficient. The legendary 10th Legion, a hardened force of professional soldiers, is dispatched under the future Emperor Vespasian and later his son Titus with a single objective: crush the revolt utterly and permanently. Their path of reconquest would have brought them inexorably toward the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, directly threatening the quiet plateau of Qumran and any other settlement in their way. For the people living in this region, whether they were the Essenes of Qumran or custodians from Jerusalem, the sight of Roman legions on the march would have been a vision of apocalyptic finality. They knew the Roman methods well: cities besieged, populations enslaved, and most horrifyingly for a text-obsessed culture, libraries and temples put to the torch. The Great Library of Alexandria had been accidentally burned by Caesar's troops just over a century earlier, a stark reminder of how easily knowledge could be erased by conquering armies. The choice would have been agonizingly clear. They could not save their lives or their buildings, but they might just be able to save their words. Their sacred texts were not merely books. They were the collective soul of their people, the blueprint for their covenant with God, and the foundation of their identity. Allowing them to be destroyed by pagan soldiers was unthinkable, and so the hiding began. This was not a leisurely, well-planned archival project. The evidence from the caves suggests a rushed, desperate operation. While some scrolls were neatly sealed inside cylindrical jars, the ancient equivalent of climate-controlled storage, others were found hastily stuffed into crevices in the cave walls, crammed into cracks in the floor, or simply left in piles. This haphazard placement speaks to a moment of extreme urgency and limited time. Imagine teams of people working by torchlight, carrying heavy jars and leather bundles up the treacherous cliffs to the 11 caves we now know held scrolls. They weren't just hiding their own community's documents. If the Jerusalem theory holds, they might have been the final recipients of a frantic, multi-source effort to safeguard the intellectual treasury of an entire nation facing extinction. The historical timeline fits this narrative with chilling precision. We know the Romans systematically subjugated the countryside before encircling Jerusalem itself. The year 68 of the Common Era is a particularly likely date for the deposit of the scrolls. It was in this year that Vespasian's forces crushed the Jewish strongholds in the north and began moving down the Jordan Valley toward the Dead Sea region. The settlement at Qumran itself shows clear archaeological evidence of a violent end. There are signs of a fierce fire, and Roman arrowheads have been found embedded in the walls, silent testimony to a final, hopeless stand. The community was wiped out or scattered, but the library they buried survived, waiting silently in the dark for 2,000 years. The scrolls are therefore not just a collection of texts. They are the last desperate act of a civilization trying to preserve its voice against the coming silence. A message in a bottle thrown into the deep well of time, hoping against hope that someone someday would find it and remember them. But the mystery of the scrolls doesn't end with ancient Jewish sects. It extends into the very foundations of another world religion, sparking one of the most contentious and fascinating debates in modern biblical scholarship. As scholars began to translate and interpret the scrolls, they encountered phrases and ideas that seemed to echo with startling clarity the language of the New Testament. This led to a bold and controversial question. Could these Jewish texts, hidden decades before the birth of Jesus, contain the seeds of Christian thought or even direct references to its central figures? The most explosive example of this is a fragmented text officially designated 4Q246. In this badly damaged manuscript, scholars reconstruct a phrase that speaks of a figure who will be called Son of God and Son of the Most High. For many reading this in the 20th century, the parallel was undeniable. These are the exact titles used by the angel Gabriel in the Gospel of Luke when announcing the birth of Jesus to Mary. The immediate, sensational implication was that the Qumran community might have been prophesying about Jesus Christ himself a century before he was born. This discovery sent shockwaves through both academic and religious circles, but a deeper analysis reveals a far more complex and historically grounded story. The figure described in this text is not a peaceful Messiah of love and salvation. The text goes on to describe him as a mighty warrior who will rule with strength and bring eternal peace through conquest. This is a classic description of a royal, Davidic Messiah, a powerful earthly king who would vanquish Israel's enemies and restore the golden age of the biblical King David. This was a common and deeply held Jewish hope during a time of foreign occupation. The title Son of God itself, while striking to modern Christian ears, had a long history in Jewish tradition. In the Hebrew Bible, it was used for angels, for the nation of Israel as a whole, and most importantly, for the Davidic kings of Judah. When a psalm refers to the king as God's son, it is a metaphor for a special, chosen relationship and a divine right to rule, not a statement of literal divinity. The figure in the Qumran text fits perfectly within this existing Jewish framework. He is a promised warrior king, not the incarnate Son of God described in Christian theology. The scrolls provide us with a rich tapestry of messianic expectation, but it is a specifically Jewish tapestry woven from the threads of scripture and the trauma of persecution. The community awaited not one but multiple messianic figures. Many texts describe a dual messiahship, a Messiah of Israel, a royal descendant of David who would lead the nation in battle and governance, and a Messiah of Aaron, a priestly figure from the lineage of Aaron who would oversee the restoration of a pure temple worship. This concept of two messiahs is completely absent from early Christian teaching, which merged the royal and priestly roles into the single person of Jesus. Furthermore, the scrolls are filled with their own unique terminology that never appears in the New Testament. They speak of the teacher of righteousness, the spouter of lies, and the wicked priest, internal figures in their own community's drama. They refer to themselves as the Yahad, the community, and the sons of light. This is the language of a closed group with its own specific history and enemies, not the language of a proto-Christian movement preparing the way for a gospel that would be preached to all nations. So why do the parallels sometimes feel so uncanny? The answer lies not in direct prophecy, but in shared soil. Both the Qumran community and the early Jesus movement were distinct branches growing from the same robust tree of Second Temple Judaism. They drank from the same spiritual well, the Hebrew Scriptures. They were shaped by the same historical pressures, Roman occupation and corruption within the Jerusalem priesthood. They shared a common vocabulary of apocalyptic hope, expecting God to intervene imminently in human history. This explains why both groups used concepts like the kingdom of God, the Holy Spirit, and the final judgment. It also explains practices like ritual immersion, communal meals, and shared property. These were not Christian innovations, they were Jewish pious practices that both groups adapted for their own purposes. The scrolls do not predict Christianity, rather, they illuminate the vibrant, diverse Jewish world that was the essential context for its emergence. They show us that what seems uniquely Christian in the New Testament is often a creative adaptation of ideas that were already circulating among devout Jewish groups yearning for redemption. The scrolls don't diminish Christian origins, they ground them in a richer, more complex historical reality, revealing Jesus and his early followers not as a sudden anomaly, but as participants in a much broader and older conversation about God, messiahs, and the meaning of Scripture. For decades, the silent ruins of Qumran and the exclusively male cemetery seemed to tell a clear story. This was a monastery for a celibate, all-male religious brotherhood. This image became so entrenched in the popular and academic imagination that it was accepted as settled fact. But the 21st century has a way of challenging our most cherished narratives, and recent archaeological work at the site has done just that, introducing compelling new evidence that forces us to reimagine daily life in this ancient desert community. The story is no longer as simple as a group of solitary men copying scrolls in isolation. It has become far more complex and surprisingly human. The most significant challenge to the old hypothesis comes from the most fundamental of archaeological sources, the bones themselves. While early excavations in the 1950s focused on the main cemetery, which contained over 1,000 graves almost entirely of adult males, later surveys began to tell a different story. In the 2000s, teams using ground-penetrating radar and carefully targeted excavations identified a much larger network of graves surrounding the main site. including several distinct secondary cemeteries. When they carefully excavated a small selection of these peripheral tombs, they made a startling discovery: the remains of women and children. This wasn't just one or two anomalous finds. In one of these nearby cemeteries, archaeologists uncovered the skeletons of several women, and in another, the fragile bones of a young child carefully laid to rest. The initial counter-argument was that these might be later Bedouin burials from a completely different era. However, carbon dating and analysis of the burial style quickly dismissed this idea. The orientation of the bodies, the construction of the graves, and the radiocarbon dates all placed these women and children squarely in the same time period as the main Qumran settlement. Their presence could no longer be explained away as an exception or an intrusion. It was an integral, though previously overlooked, part of the site's history. Beyond the cemeteries, new analysis of the settlement itself has revealed a more nuanced picture of daily life. Re-examinations of the pottery have identified a wider variety of vessel types than previously noted, including forms commonly associated with domestic activities like cooking and food storage, not just the large jars for communal dining. Furthermore, the discovery of small, delicate artifacts like cosmetic tools and jewelry in some areas of the ruin, though rare, hints at a female presence within the community itself. These objects don't necessarily point to a large population of women, but they strongly suggest that the social structure was not the strictly celibate male enclave we once imagined. So what does this mean for the Essene hypothesis? It doesn't necessarily destroy it, but it profoundly complicates it. Ancient historians like Josephus actually noted that there was a second order of Essenes who did marry and have families. It is entirely possible that Qumran was home to both a core group of celibate men and a surrounding, supporting community of married Essenes and their children. These families might have handled the practical, day-to-day labor required to sustain the settlement, managing livestock, tending crops, producing pottery, and preparing food, freeing the scholarly core to focus on ritual purity and the sacred work of copying text. This would create a layered community with a celibate inner circle and a familial outer circle, all sharing the same core beliefs and commitment to the sect. This revised view transforms Qumran from a stark monastery into a living, breathing village, complete with the sounds of family life echoing alongside the silent concentration of the scriptorium. It suggests a community that was separate from the mainstream, but not entirely isolated from the realities of human relationships and family structures. The people who wrote, copied, and protected the Dead Sea Scrolls may have been fathers and mothers as well as brothers and priests, all united in a common purpose to preserve their sacred tradition against a world they believed was rushing toward its final reckoning. For centuries, the most fragile scrolls remained locked away, their secrets imprisoned by their own brittleness. A scholar could spend a lifetime studying a single fragment, squinting at faded ink and puzzling over gaps in the text, always aware that the slightest touch could reduce 2,000 years of history to dust. But a technological revolution has changed everything, granting us a kind of supernatural sight to read the unreadable. The key to this new era is multispectral imaging, a process that feels more like alchemy than science. Instead of relying on the narrow spectrum of visible light that our eyes can perceive, this technology captures images of the scrolls at dozens of different wavelengths, from ultraviolet to infrared. What appears as a blank or smudged piece of parchment to the naked eye can reveal hidden writing under specific light frequencies. The ink, often made from carbon-based soot or iron gall, absorbs and reflects light differently than the animal skin it's written on, and these subtle differences are amplified and analyzed by sophisticated software. The result is nothing short of miraculous. Letters and words once thought lost forever emerge from the darkness with stunning clarity, as if the scribe had just lifted his pen. This digital resurrection is revealing a hidden layer of scribal activity that was completely invisible to previous generations of scholars. We are no longer just reading the final, polished product. We are peering over the shoulders of the scribes as they worked, watching them think and correct in real time. Multispectral imaging has uncovered a wealth of marginal notes, tiny corrections, and even instructions written in the margins or between the lines. These are not part of the official text, they are the workshop notes of the scriptorium. A faint word might be crossed out and a replacement written above it. A forgotten line might be inserted in the margin with a delicate arrow pointing to its proper place. Sometimes we find a simple note from a head scribe to an apprentice, like a teacher grading a paper, indicating a mistake that needs to be fixed in the next copy. These minute details are transforming our understanding of the scrolls from static monuments of text into dynamic, living documents that were actively used, studied, and perfected. The most profound revelations are coming from the most damaged scrolls, those that were essentially considered lost causes. The Book of Leviticus from the En-Gedi scroll is a landmark example. Discovered in 1970 but charred into a lump of blackened carbon in an ancient fire, it was impossible to handle, let alone read. It sat in a museum cabinet for decades, a heartbreaking mystery. Then researchers used a technique called microcomputed tomography, a super high-resolution 3D X-ray scan. They digitally unwrapped the scroll without ever touching it, virtually slicing through its layers 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. Advanced algorithms then detected the trace amounts of metal in the ink, distinguishing it from the burned papyrus and mapping the letters onto a screen. From a shapeless lump of ash, the complete text of Leviticus materialized, word perfect. This wasn't just about recovering a known book of the Bible. It was proof that we can now recover texts from the brink of oblivion, opening the door for other scrolls too damaged to ever be physically opened. All of this new data is providing a treasure trove of clues about authorship. The corrections and marginalia are like forensic evidence, revealing the human hands behind the texts. By analyzing the handwriting of these notes, paleographers can now identify different correctors working on the same scroll. A master scribe might have written the main text, but a different, perhaps less experienced hand might have made the corrections, suggesting a hierarchy within the writing studio. The types of mistakes being corrected are also telling. Some are simple copying errors, a skipped word or a repeated line, which points to the tedious and difficult nature of the work. Others are more theological or linguistic, changing a word to a line with a particular sectarian interpretation or a preferred spelling. This shows the scribes weren't just passive copy machines, they were active editors, ensuring the text conformed to their community's specific beliefs and standards. The very process of transmission was an act of interpretation. This granular, digital analysis is allowing scholars to map the connections between scrolls with unprecedented precision. It's creating a kind of family tree of manuscripts by comparing the unique handwriting styles, spelling choices, and even the patterns of corrections across different scrolls. Researchers can begin to group them into schools or workshops. They can identify a master scribe and then potentially trace his students by their similar but distinct styles appearing in other documents. This moves the discussion beyond broad theories about Essenes or Sadducees and into the realm of individual artisans and their collaborative networks. We are starting to see the contours of a sophisticated literary culture with master copyists, apprentices in training, and a shared tradition of textual transmission that valued both incredible accuracy and deliberate theological shaping. The technology isn't replacing scholarship, it's giving scholars a powerful new lens, turning faint scratches on ancient leather into a vibrant conversation across the millennia. Yet this very wealth of material presents a paradox at the heart of the mystery. How could one small, isolated community possibly produce and maintain such a breathtakingly diverse library? The texts represent not just different genres, but fundamentally different and sometimes opposing worldviews. The presence of this variety forces us to reconsider the very nature of the collection. Was this a single sect's comprehensive reference library, curated over centuries to include even the texts of their ideological opponents for study and refutation? Or does this incredible diversity point to a more complex origin, a geniza, or sacred storage, containing the treasured texts of multiple Jewish groups from across Judea, all hidden together in a time of crisis? Consider the practical reality of the biblical manuscripts alone. The sheer number of copies, particularly of books like Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms, indicates a community for whom the study and precise transmission of Scripture was the highest calling. These weren't just books on a shelf, they were the foundational documents of their faith, constantly handled, copied, and debated. The existence of multiple versions of the same book, like the two distinct Isaiah scrolls found in Cave 1, is particularly telling. One is a pristine, beautifully executed formal copy, likely used for liturgical reading. The other is more informal, with corrections and a freer handwriting style, probably a working study copy. This suggests a living, breathing scholarly environment where the text was not frozen but actively engaged with. Then, placed right alongside these universal scriptures, we find the intensely sectarian works that define the community's unique identity. The community rule and the war scroll are insular documents meant for initiates only. They are filled with a powerful sense of exclusivity and an urgent expectation of an imminent end of days. The war scroll, with its meticulous, almost obsessive planning for a final 40-year cosmic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, paints a picture of a group that saw itself as God's army, training in the wilderness for a divine confrontation. This is raw, dualistic apocalypticism, a belief that the present world is corrupt beyond repair. Yet in the very same caves, we find texts that reflect a completely different preoccupation. The temple scroll is less concerned with an imminent apocalypse and more focused on the perfect, practical operation of a temple and a society governed by a strict, literal interpretation of God's law. This text reads like a constitutional blueprint for a functioning theocracy, obsessed with ritual purity, temple architecture, and the precise calendar for festivals. Its tone is legal and prescriptive, not apocalyptic and expectant. It's difficult to reconcile the community that produced the chaotic, fervent vision of the war scroll with the one that composed the methodical, detailed legal code of the temple scroll. Could the same group truly hold both of these vastly different perspectives simultaneously? Further deepening the mystery are the texts that actively argue with other Jewish groups of the time. The document known as MMT, or Some Works of the Law, is essentially a list of legal disagreements between the author's group and the mainstream religious authorities in Jerusalem. It lays out over 20 points of dispute on matters of temple purity, priestly gifts, and agricultural laws. This text isn't just stating a different opinion, it's engaged in a live, polemical debate, defining its own identity in opposition to others. Finding such a specific, argumentative text alongside more universal biblical scrolls creates a fascinating portrait of a collection that contains both the common core of Jewish belief and the sharp, defining edges of sectarian conflict. This theological smorgasbord is perhaps the strongest argument against a simple, single authorship model. It suggests the Qumran caves served as a time capsule for a much wider world of Jewish thought. As the Roman threat loomed in the mid-1st century, different Jewish groups, Essenes, but also Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and others, may have made the desperate decision to safeguard their most precious texts in the same remote location. They chose preservation over sectarianism, ensuring that the rich diversity of Second Temple Judaism would not be erased by the Roman legions. The library, therefore, is not a snapshot of one community's beliefs, but a panoramic family album of an entire civilization's spiritual life, a last will and testament hastily buried in the desert sands. This selective preservation we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls library is one of the most telling clues about the people who amassed it. It wasn't a random collection. It was a curated reflection of their deepest beliefs and their identity as a community set apart. When we look at which biblical books are present and in what numbers and which are conspicuously absent, we begin to see a clear theological blueprint emerge. The most striking example of their preference is the Book of Psalms, which appears in at least 36 different copies, more than any other text. For this community, the Psalms were far more than hymns. They were a living, breathing roadmap for worship, a source of legal precedent, and a rich tapestry of prophecy. They saw their own struggles and hopes reflected in the Psalms of Lament and the Songs of Victory. The frequent copying of Psalms suggests it was central to their daily liturgical life and their personal piety. Close behind are the books of Deuteronomy and Isaiah, each found in over 20 copies. Deuteronomy, with its emphasis on God's law, covenant, and the blessings and curses for obedience and disobedience, provided the foundational legal and theological framework for their separatist lifestyle. Isaiah, filled with visions of a purified remnant, a coming Messiah, and a new creation, spoke directly to their apocalyptic expectations and their self-understanding as that very remnant preparing the way in the wilderness. This stands in stark contrast to the books that are virtually absent. Most notably, there is not a single, undisputed copy of the Book of Esther among the scrolls. This is a deafening silence. The story of Esther is a tale of Jewish survival in the Persian diaspora, achieved through clever diplomacy, concealment of identity, and assimilation into the court of a foreign king. Its absence is likely a powerful theological statement. The Qumran community defined itself by separation from foreign influence and a rejection of the corrupt priesthood in Jerusalem. Esther's narrative of successful integration into a Gentile power structure and its complete lack of any mention of God would have been fundamentally at odds with their worldview. Similarly, the Book of Nehemiah, which details the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls under the permission and protection of a Persian emperor, is also missing. Their vision was not of rebuilding a compromised city, but of awaiting a divinely ordained new temple and a new Jerusalem. This pattern of inclusion and exclusion points to a community in the midst of defining its own canon. They were not working with a fixed, closed list of sacred books as we might understand it today. Instead, they were emphasizing the texts that most directly supported their unique interpretation of Scripture and their understanding of the end times. The multiple copies of certain books also suggest they may have used different versions or textual traditions. For instance, some of the Psalms scrolls include psalms not found in the traditional Masoretic text, indicating their canon was still fluid and adaptable to their specific liturgical and prophetic needs. This wasn't about rejecting a settled Bible. It was about actively shaping a library of texts that would sustain and justify their radical existence in the desert, reinforcing their identity as the true inheritors of God's promises and the sole guardians of His true meaning. The languages preserved on these ancient pages offer a different kind of map, one that charts not just what was written, but where the writers might have come from and how they were trained. The overwhelming majority of the scrolls are in Hebrew, the sacred language of scripture and prayer, but this Hebrew itself is not a single monolithic entity. Scholars have identified at least 3 distinct dialects or styles woven through the texts. The most formal is often called Biblical Hebrew, a conservative, elegant style used primarily for copying the books of the Torah and the prophets. This is the language of the great Isaiah scroll, a deliberate and stately script meant to honor and preserve tradition with as little change as possible. Then there is what's known as Qumran Hebrew, a dialect that feels more vernacular, more alive. It appears in the sectarian works like the Community Rule and the War Scroll, featuring unique spellings, grammatical forms, and vocabulary not found in the standard biblical texts. This wasn't a mistake. It was the living, breathing language of the community itself, the tongue they used to discuss their rules and record their visions, suggesting they had developed their own distinct linguistic identity over time. Beyond these two Hebrew styles, we find a third, even more fascinating layer, the influence of Mishnaic or Rabbinic Hebrew. This was the language of the rabbis that would flourish after the destruction of the Second Temple, the foundation of the Talmud. Finding its early forms in the Dead Sea Scrolls was a revelation. It pushes the history of this dialect back centuries, proving it wasn't a new invention but an evolution from the spoken Hebrew of the late Second Temple period. This linguistic bridge connects the world of the scrolls directly to the future of Rabbinic Judaism, showing that the authors weren't isolated from the broader linguistic currents of their time. They were participants in a living, evolving language, adopting and adapting the colloquial forms of their day for their own sacred writings. The way they spelled words is particularly telling. Some scribes used a full spelling, generously adding letters to represent vowel sounds, which made texts easier to read aloud. Others used a defective spelling, a more archaic and sparse style that required the reader to already know the pronunciation. This variation is a powerful clue pointing to different scribble schools or training traditions, rather than a single, unified scriptorium with one rigid style guide. Yet Hebrew was not the only voice in this desert library. The presence of Aramaic texts is profoundly significant. By the 1st century, Aramaic had become the lingua franca of the Near East, the common language of trade, diplomacy, and everyday conversation for millions, including Jesus and his disciples. Finding Aramaic scrolls at Qumran, such as parts of the books of Enoch and Tobit, and even Aramaic translations of the Book of Job, tells us that this community was engaged with the wider world. They weren't solely focused on their own sectarian Hebrew texts. They were studying, preserving, and likely understanding popular religious literature that was circulating throughout Judea and beyond, written in the language of the people. This shatters the image of a hermetically sealed community. It suggests they were consumers of a broader Jewish literary culture, drawing on apocalyptic ideas and stories that were popular across different groups. The quality of the Aramaic varies as well, with some texts displaying a sophisticated, literary dialect and others a more common, everyday form, again hinting at different authors or sources for this material. Perhaps the most surprising linguistic discovery was the presence of Greek. While only a small fraction of the scrolls are in Greek, their existence is a bombshell. These aren't just fragments, they include portions of the Hebrew Bible itself, specifically a Greek translation of the 12 minor prophets. This proves that the community had access to and saw value in the Septuagint, the seminal Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures crafted for Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria. This is a staggering implication. The group, often portrayed as the most separatist and hostile to foreign influence, actually had Greek texts in their library. It suggests that some members were likely bilingual or even trilingual, comfortable enough with Greek to study scripture in it. This doesn't mean they abandoned their Hebrew heritage. Rather, it shows a pragmatic engagement with the wider Hellenistic world they lived in. The Greek texts might have been brought by educated members who joined the community from the diaspora, or perhaps they were part of a collection of important Jewish works gathered from various sources, further supporting the theory that the Qumran caves served as a repository for a much wider spectrum of Jewish thought than just their own. To truly grasp the unique voice of the Dead Sea Scroll authors, we must listen to them not in isolation, but as part of a much larger conversation happening across ancient Judea. Their library did not emerge from a vacuum. It was deeply interwoven with a rich tapestry of Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, texts that were exploring bold new theological frontiers. By placing the scrolls beside works like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, we hear a powerful chorus of shared ideas, revealing the authors not as total outliers, but as influential participants in the most cutting-edge religious thought of their era. Consider the astronomical and cosmological visions that captivated so many writers at this time. The community at Qumran was utterly obsessed with a perfect, unchanging solar calendar, a divine timetable they believed was ordained at creation. This was not an idea they invented. It is the central premise of the Book of Jubilees, a text that retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus but frames them within a rigid chronology of 49-year Jubilee cycles. Multiple copies of Jubilees were found in the Qumran caves, and it was clearly treated with an authority bordering on scripture. The community didn't just own this book, they internalized its worldview, adopting its solar calendar as a non-negotiable article of faith that set them in direct opposition to the lunar calendar used by the temple priests in Jerusalem. Their fierce calendar dispute was, in essence, a battle over which text jubilees or the traditions of the priesthood held the true key to God's sacred time. This fascination with the heavenly realms extends even further into the mystical with the Book of Enoch. Several extensive portions of Enoch, including the famous Book of the Watchers, were discovered among the scrolls written in Aramaic. This text delves into fantastical territory, describing the fall of the angelic Watchers, Enoch's celestial journeys where he is shown the secrets of the universe and the coming great judgment. For the Qumran community, this wasn't seen as heretical fiction. It was divine revelation. The same themes saturate their own sectarian writings. Their concept of a final, apocalyptic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, detailed in the War Scroll, directly echoes the cosmic battle described in Enoch. Their emphasis on the revelatory power of dreams and visions finds a clear precedent in Enoch's own experiences. The community saw themselves as the rightful heirs to this Enochian tradition of hidden knowledge, the chosen few who could understand these celestial secrets and prepare for the impending divine judgment. The connections go beyond simple borrowing. The presence of these texts, copied and preserved with such care, suggests the authors saw themselves as part of a specific intellectual lineage. They were the custodians of what scholars call the Enochic and Jubilean tradition, a stream of Jewish thought that emphasized revelation outside the standard Mosaic law, a focus on the heavenly priesthood, angelology, and a deterministic view of history barreling toward a preordained climax. This aligns them with other groups who valued these texts, but the Qumran community took it further. They didn't just study these ideas, they built their entire communal identity around them. The calendar from Jubilees became their daily rhythm. The cosmic war from Enoch became their military manual. They operationalized the mysticism of these texts into a practical, disciplined way of life in the desert. Yet, this very embrace also highlights what made them distinct. While other Jewish groups might have read Enoch or Jubilees, the Qumran community granted them an authority that others did not. For the Pharisees, who would become the founders of Rabbinic Judaism, the core of divine authority lay in the Torah and the developing oral law. The wild apocalypticism of Enoch, while influential, remained on the periphery. For the Qumran authors, it was central. This tells us they occupied a specific, radical wing within broader Jewish thought. They were the heirs and amplifiers of these esoteric traditions, the group that took the most extreme conclusions from them and built a fortress of faith around them. Their library, therefore, is a perfect snapshot of this dynamic. It contains the widely shared biblical texts that formed the common ground of all Judaism, but it is weighted heavily toward the specific, apocalyptic, and mystical texts that define their unique and separatist identity, showing us they were both a part of and a profound reaction to the diverse world of Second Temple Judaism. Yet for decades after their discovery, the vast majority of these world-altering documents remained locked away, inaccessible not in desert caves but in a modern academic stronghold known unofficially as the Scroll Cartel. This small, secretive international team of scholars, granted exclusive publication rights, moved at an agonizingly slow pace, hoarding fragments and withholding photographs from the wider academic community. The result was a half-century of stifled research, where a handful of individuals held a monopoly on interpreting humanity's shared heritage, fueling conspiracy theories and creating a modern controversy that strangely mirrored the ancient sectarianism described in the scrolls themselves. The intense desire to protect their own reputations and control the narrative ironically repeated the very patterns of exclusive ownership and secret knowledge that the Qumran community itself might have practiced. This academic bottleneck finally broke in the 1990s, not through internal reform but through external pressure and an act of scholarly rebellion. The delay had become a full-blown scandal, criticized in major publications and even the United States Congress. The dam truly burst when researchers at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, working without official approval, reconstructed unpublished texts from a concordance that had been secretly circulated. They then threatened to publish their reconstructions, forcing the hand of the official team. This pressure, combined with the appointment of a new, more open chief editor, led to a radical change in policy. All restrictions were lifted, and the entire corpus of scrolls was suddenly made available to any qualified scholar who wished to study them. The era of exclusivity was over, but the decades of delay had a lasting impact, creating a backlog of analysis and allowing entrenched interpretations to solidify without the benefit of full peer review. The newfound freedom of access, while a victory for open scholarship, unleashed a new set of conflicts, this time fought in academic journals and conference halls. With the entire library now available, long-held theories were suddenly open to challenge from every direction. The once dominant Essene hypothesis, which had enjoyed decades without serious competition, now faced a barrage of fresh critiques from scholars armed with the full evidence. These weren't just minor quibbles, they were fundamental attacks on the core narrative. Some archaeologists, re-examining the site of Qumran, argued it was a villa or a fort, not a monastery. Other historians pointed to the diversity of texts as proof the scrolls were a Jerusalem library, not a sectarian production. The debates became heated, personal, and public, with each camp marshalling its evidence to support a vastly different vision of who wrote these texts and why. These modern academic battles have profoundly shaped and at times dangerously obscured our view of the ancient authors. The intense desire to prove or disprove a single theory has sometimes led scholars to overemphasize evidence that supports their view while downplaying contradictory clues. For instance, a proponent of the Essene theory might highlight the descriptions of communal meals in the scrolls while minimizing the archaeological finds of women's jewelry at the site. Conversely, a supporter of the Jerusalem library theory might focus on the variety of scribble hands while glossing over the deeply sectarian nature of texts like the community rule. This partisan interpretation creates a distorted picture, forcing the complex, multifaceted evidence into a simplistic either-or binary that the ancient reality likely never was. The legacy of these modern conflicts is a field of study that is both incredibly vibrant and frustratingly fractured. There is no consensus, and perhaps there never will be. Yet this very lack of agreement is, in a way, a fitting tribute to the scrolls themselves. They were born from a time of intense debate and diverse Jewish thought, and the modern scholarly world wrestling with their meaning has, perhaps unintentionally, recreated that same vibrant, contentious, and multifaceted conversation. The struggle to understand the authors is a reminder that history is rarely a simple puzzle with one missing piece. It is a complex tapestry where every thread we pull seems to reveal new patterns and connections, ensuring that the mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls remains as alive and compelling today as it was when a shepherd's stray stone first shattered the silence of a desert cave. So where does this leave us in our quest to solve the mystery of these ancient authors? Despite the mountains of research and analysis, the fundamental question remains tantalizingly unresolved. We are left with a collection of compelling clues rather than a single, definitive answer. The elegant simplicity of the Essene hypothesis has been permanently complicated by the sheer diversity of the texts, the presence of women and children in the cemeteries, and the realization that the library may represent a much broader tapestry of Jewish thought. Was Qumran the home of a single radical sect, a scriptorium for hire, a fortified farm that later became a hiding place, or the guardian of a pan-Judean time capsule? Each theory possesses its own compelling evidence and its own critical weaknesses, ensuring the debate continues to simmer with intellectual fervor. This lack of a neat conclusion isn't a failure of scholarship. It is a testament to the profound complexity of the past and the silent cunning of the people who left these puzzles behind for us to unravel. The search for answers is far from over. In fact, it is entering a thrilling new phase. Archaeologists are returning to the Judean desert with fresh questions and sophisticated technology, conducting systematic surveys of every cave and crevice in the cliffs surrounding the Dead Sea. Recent expeditions have yielded stunning results, uncovering a handful of new scroll fragments in what is known as the Cave of Horrors and the Cave of Skulls, names that speak to the harsh and deadly environment these searchers must navigate. These new fragments, though small, are priceless, proving that the desert still holds secrets waiting to be found. More exciting still is the ongoing analysis of the previously excavated caves using ground-penetrating radar and residue analysis, techniques that can detect hidden chambers or the chemical traces of ancient ink and parchment long since decayed into dust. Every season in the field has the potential to deliver the one missing piece that could finally tilt the scales in this great historical debate. Our greatest hope for unlocking these secrets, however, lies not in the field alone, but in the laboratory. The digital revolution that brought us multispectral imaging is just the beginning. Artificial intelligence is now being trained to recognize and classify minute variations in scribble handwriting with a speed and accuracy no human paleographer could ever match, potentially allowing us to group scrolls by individual scribes and trace their movements across different manuscripts and even different proposed locations. Genetic testing on the animal skins used for parchment is another frontier just starting to be explored. By analyzing the DNA of the sheep and goats, scientists could potentially map the geographic origins of the materials, revealing whether the parchment was produced locally near the Dead Sea or brought from flocks tended near Jerusalem or other distant regions. Even the ink itself holds molecular clues about its recipe that could point to specific workshops or regional traditions. The enduring mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls authors is what makes them so perennially fascinating. They are a powerful reminder that history is not a simple puzzle to be solved, but an ongoing conversation across the centuries. We may never know their names or see their faces, but through their words we can hear their debates, feel their hopes, and understand their fears. They were real people living in a turbulent time who believed so deeply in the power of their ideas that they went to extraordinary lengths to preserve them, ensuring their voices would whisper to us from the depths of 2 millennia. The next chapter of this story will be written by the combination of relentless curiosity and breathtaking technology, a partnership that promises to keep pulling us deeper into their world, ever closer to the truth hiding just beyond the next turn.